All right, we are on to what would have been week 5, making, implementing, and evaluating social policy. And this covers chapter 6 through 8 in your text, and also covers kind of the basics of the policy process. So if you've taken a public policy course, I don't think many of you have, some of this is going to be repeat for you. You may have heard some of it in another type of politics course. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and I can go over things more in depth if there's something that doesn't make sense or that you're just are curious about, okay? So when we think about actually making public policy, that word public is really important because public policy in a democracy should reflect the interest of all citizens to the greatest extent possible. No one will ever be 100% represented. That's the nature of our political system. But to the greatest extent possible, it should reflect broad interests of society, right? But political participation has the same types of impacts on policy that it does on politics, right? And that is that low participation rates mean that policy often reflects elite interests, right? Now, low participation rates typically yield a particular balance, right? People who are better able to participate, so they're better educated, they're wealthier, they're able to do things, they have the social and political capital to be able to participate. That means they're going to have more influence on policy making, right? So if we think about that, policy might often then reflect elite interest. Now, please note that this does not always break down along party or ideological lines, right? So it's not like Democrats versus Republicans on every single policy issue. Instead, on many social policy issues, it becomes a matter of elites versus general public or mass public opinions. And I'll give some examples in a minute when I talk about elitism or elite theory. So policy is an element of politics, and politics is an element of policy, right? They're all kind of tied in together. They're both tied in together. Those who are most often the targets of social policy, though, are the ones who cannot participate effectively. And they most often have to rely on others to participate on their behalf or to advocate on their behalf, right? And that's because they either have some barriers to participation or they're just not allowed to participate legally, right? So children, for example, children are not going to lobby for a particular public policy. Children can't vote. So their interests are typically represented by others or by advocacy groups. Felons, the mentally ill, intellectually disabled, the homeless, right? These are groups that either have barriers to participation or are legally not allowed to participate. And again, we often find their interests represented by external groups, the voluntary sector, which we'll talk about later, or advocacy groups, or simply other voters and other participants, right? So let's talk then about two major theories of the policy process, right? So these are also theories that are very popular to explain how politics works. So you might have run across them in other contexts. But in this context, we're thinking about these kind of broad theories as a way to explain or describe how policy gets made, right? And these two are often compared or contrasted when we think about trying to explain the political system as a whole. The first one is elite theory. What is sometimes referenced to as the elite theory of politics or just elitism, right? And the idea here is that social, cultural, political, and economic elites try to maintain power by controlling social policy to their advantage, right? And that may, in fact, exclude marginal groups, and it doesn't have to be intended to exclude those marginal groups. Even if the intent is not there, if that's the consequence, it would still be marginalization, right? When we think about elites, again, social, political, cultural, and economic elites, they may cross over in those groups, they may not. But those groups of individuals are, in elite theory, trying to maintain power via control of social policy, right? So control of the status quo with regard to whatever social policy area you might be interested in. So elite theory in order to work, or in order for elite theory to be true or a good way to explain political behavior and policy process, two assumptions are made. The first one is that the values and preferences of the elite are different than the values and preferences of the general public, right? So that they have different interests, and not just different interests, but they genuinely have different values, different things that they're concerned about from a very basic point of view. And then the second assumption is that the values and preferences of elites are not only different from the mass public, but they're more influential than the mass public, right? In other words, if elites want it, it happens, okay? Here's where we see elitism bridging ideological divides, right? So, for example, you might expect there to be a very clear Republican and Democratic or liberal and conservative divide on something like immigration and immigration policy, right? In fact, where we see more of a divide is not between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and masses, but between elites and, liberals and conservatives, but between elites and masses, right? Most business leaders and most economic elites actually support fairly liberal immigration policies, even if they're Republicans. They want cheaper labor, and they want competitive inputs into the labor process, right? So you'll actually see, this is one reason that it's so difficult to make any headway on immigration legislation, is that there are some real internal divides among both parties, actually, on this kind of elite versus general public perception and view of immigration policy, right? So this is not always an ideological thing. It's often, again, an economic thing, economic elites versus the general public, and that kind of is cross-cutting in ideology or partisanship. Another example would be neoliberal Democrats who favor financial deregulation, right? A lot of people blame the Clinton administration for helping to kind of set in motion the deregulation of the financial industry that the Bush administration then kind of continued on, which led us to the housing bubble and the recession that began in 2008, okay, 2007, 2008. Again, that's an elite and mass thing, not a divide ideologically, okay? The second theory, in a clear contrast to elite theory, is group theory, often referred to as pluralism. And this is a theory that explains politics and policy process as a product of kind of the competition among different interests or groups in society, right? And so social policy, what the output and outcome from social policy is, that output and outcome is the sum total of trade-offs among those different groups or interests in society, right? If this sounds like James Madison in the Federalist Papers, it's because it is, right? Pluralism is essentially Madisonian democracy in action, where you have more and more and more faction. You remember that from the Federalist Papers? What's the cure to faction? More faction, right? More groups competing, more groups setting out a stake in the policy process or in the political process. And so they balance each other out. And the trade-offs that they make among themselves become the way that policy is developed and influenced at the government level. Note the word trade-offs and remember welfare economics. And remember that Edgeworth box where I showed you the contract curve showing trade-offs among different parties in an economy. This is the exact same idea, just produced a little bit differently, okay? You often see kind of this idea of group theory at work in issue advocacy campaigns, which you see advertisements on television or internet advertisements that are not for a particular party or candidate, but they're advocating for a particular position on an issue. Like recently you've seen a lot on trade and free trade and fair trade, right? You've seen a lot of ads on that. They may have an ideological position, but they're not specifically tied to a candidate or party. Again, it's more the issue itself, right? Now, just like there are assumptions that elite theory makes, group theory and pluralism makes assumptions too, right? And one of those assumptions is that all interests are equally represented, or at least that there's some equality of opportunity when it comes to representation, right? That if you have a position, you can adequately voice that position in the political or the policy arena. Now, this assumption is sometimes problematic, right? Famous political scientist E.E. Schachtschneider once said that the problem with the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strongly upper-class accent. Let me say that again, that the problem with the pluralist heaven, this ideal of pluralism, is that the choir, the heavenly chorus, sings with a strongly upper-class accent. And the idea, of course, is that even if we assume that we live in a Madisonian democracy, a plural democracy, that the better represented and wealthier interests are still going to be the ones that rise to the top, because they're the loudest and they're the better resourced, right? And so we're still going to end up with some undue elite influence, even though we have groups competing, and that's supposed to kind of balance out or kind of sum total the public in general, right? Of course, we know that those groups that are least likely to be organized in society are the ones that are most directly impacted by government services. So, for example, the homeless, right? Very hard to organize the homeless into a group that can voice its interest or voice its concerns in the policy process. And so that becomes part of that concern about whose voices are really heard. Pluralism is certainly an ideal. Is it practical? Does it really work? And if so, how do we in fact make sure that all interests have either equal opportunity to be represented, or they are in fact equally represented? One last note, as we think about elitism and pluralism as kind of structuring theories for thinking about politics and policy, the text does this interesting thing about social stratification of the population, and the table, I believe, I wrote this down, it's on page 172, and I've kind of recreated it just a little bit here, but this is kind of attempting to break down the population really on the terms of economic elitism versus pluralism, and thinking about the degree to which each group in society has A, ownership of resources, and B, the ability to control goals, right? So to set goals for society, what we say we're going to provide for our population, what we think is a minimum standard of living, right? Think of goals as those things, right? And so the elite groups here are the wealthy, executives, and professionals. And the wealthy, of course, own resources, and they have significant control over goals, those things we decide as a society that we care about and that we're going to provide through public policy. They don't have as much control over means of implementation as executives do, and executives are that second group. They have some control over goals, but they have a lot of control over means. In other words, how those goals are met via policy, because they often control the implementation or administrative arm of either government or corporations, right? Then you have professionals, is kind of the next group. They have fairly high control over means, and they can influence goal setting, but they don't have a lot of control over goals. So these would be kind of like white-collar, middle managers, people who are kind of between the next three groups, and then executives and the wealthy, right? The three groups that are considered probably not elite are organized workers. They may have some control over means by which goals are realized because they're the ones actually doing the work. So they can influence goals somewhat, but they are not as well resourced. The working poor have little control, in fact, no control over goals or resources, and they have this shared frustration that can lead them to political involvement. So think about the labor movement. And then we have the underclass has no control at all, and they don't even have the control of work, right? Because they're not working. So they have this sense of failure and